Hi, thank you for joining me. This is Manufactured Reality by Jason Gray. There comes a point in a person's life when the question is no longer whether they have been deceived. The real question becomes how deep the deception goes. Most people never arrive at that threshold. They sense contradiction, hypocrisy, and corruption in isolated forms, but they still cling to the assumption that truth itself remains mostly intact. They believe the world may be flawed, governments may be dishonest, institutions may be compromised, media may be manipulative, and history may be selective, but beneath all of that, they still assume there is a stable core of reality being faithfully presented to them. Then one day, that illusion cracks, and when it cracks, it does not crack in one place, it cracks everywhere. You begin by doubting one narrative, and before long, you find yourself staring into the possibility that deception was never a glitch in the system, it was the system. Not merely a tool used now and then by bad actors, but a foundational strategy embedded into the very architecture of civilization. Not just lies about one event or one era or one institution, but distortions layered across nearly every domain through which human beings come to know themselves and the world: history, religion, culture, economics, medicine, education, science, identity, power, and even the meaning of existence itself. This is the scale of the real question. Why? Why would humanity be lied to so thoroughly, so repeatedly, so universally, and so early that most people cannot even tell the difference between what they were taught and what is true? Because the greatest form of power is not physical domination, it is epistemological domination. I really hope I pronounced that correctly. It is the power to define what another mind is allowed to call real. Physical chains are crude. They create resistance. They provoke revolt. They are visible, and because they are visible, they can be fought. But a false worldview inserted into the mind from birth is infinitely more efficient. A body in chains knows it is imprisoned. A mind conditioned inside a false reality will often defend the prison as freedom. That is the first stone to turn over. Human beings are not controlled primarily through force. They are controlled through interpretation, through framing, through boundary setting, through the shaping of what is thinkable, sayable, researchable, acceptable, respectable, and sane. Once those invisible fences are established, the prison can appear as civilization, obedience can appear as reason, and repetition can appear as truth. That is why the lie must be large. A small lie only hides a fact. A large lie creates a world. And when a world is built on lies, those born into it do not experience it as deception, they experience it as normalcy. This is what makes the epic scale deception so effective. It does not merely conceal reality. It replaces reality with a prefabricated interpretive grid. It gives people names for things before they have ever encountered those things directly. It teaches them what events mean before they have examined the evidence. It teaches them what counts as intelligence, what counts as madness, what counts as morality, what counts as history, what counts as progress, and what counts as authority. By the time a person reaches adulthood, the categories through which they think have already been furnished for them, and this is why so few people recognize the extent of the lie. They assume a lie is a false statement, but the deepest lie is not a statement, it is a structure of consciousness, a structure of preloaded assumptions, a civilization-wide operating system installed so early and so thoroughly that most people never realized they did not author their own mind. To lie to humanity on an epic scale is not merely to spread false information. It is to colonize the mechanisms by which truth is judged in the first place. That is the real war. Not simply over facts, but over the criteria by which facts are accepted. Not simply over history, but over who gets to write history. Not simply over morality, but over who gets to define good and evil. Not simply over knowledge, but over the architecture of belief itself. Once you understand this, much of human civilization begins to look different. You begin to see that institutions do not merely distribute information, they manufacture consensus. Consensus is one of the most powerful instruments ever created. Most people mistake it for proof. If enough people repeat something, believe something, teach something, publish something, legislate something, or punish dissent against something, the average person begins to assume there must be substance underneath it. But consensus is not the same as truth. It is often the byproduct of pressure, conditioning, incentives, repetition, and fear. Truth can stand alone. Consensus needs reinforcement. This is why children are not taught how to think as much as they are taught what to think within socially approved boundaries. The aim is not to awaken intelligence in its wild and sovereign form. The aim is to produce predictability, to create citizens who can navigate the existing grid without questioning the grid itself, to train memory more than discernment, compliance more than inquiry, and performance more than perception. A truly awakened mind is dangerous to any system built on managed reality because it begins awakening the forbidden question again and again. That's interesting how I read that. I'm going to read it again because I read it wrong. A truly awakened mind is dangerous to any system built on managed reality because it begins asking the forbidden question again and again. Who benefits from this being believed? That question is devastating because it reveals that narratives are rarely neutral. Stories do not dominate civilizations by accident. They are curated because they produce effects. They shape conduct. They distribute legitimacy. They transfer power. They condition aspiration. They assign guilt. They generate dependency, and they determine who is trusted, who is mocked, who is feared, and who is obeyed. Narratives are behavioral technology. That is why history matters so much. A people without accurate history are infinitely easier to govern because their memory has been severed. Once collective memory is fragmented, fabricated, or overwritten, people become disoriented. They do not know where they came from. They do not know what was lost. They do not know what was altered, and they cannot compare the present against a truthful past because the past they have been given is itself a managed story. When a civilization loses truthful memory, it loses more than information. It loses self-recognition. It becomes manipulatable at the level of identity. This may be the deepest consequence of all. Lies on an epic scale do not merely hide events. They estrange human beings from themselves. They make people inherit names for reality that are foreign to their own direct intuition. They learn to distrust what they sense and trust what they are told. Over time, this generates a profound internal split. A person feels one thing but repeats another, sees contradiction but suppresses it, senses manipulation but lacks the language or courage to name it. This is how psychological domestication occurs. The individual becomes divided against their own perception, and once that division is normalized, authority no longer has to conquer from the outside. It has been installed within. This is why the lie cannot be partial. It must be immersive. If only one thing were lied about, it could be isolated and corrected. But if everything is threaded together, then each lie supports the next. False history supports false identity. False identity supports false morality. False morality supports false politics. False politics supports false economics. False economics supports artificial scarcity. Artificial scarcity supports dependency. Dependency supports fear. Fear supports obedience. Obedience supports the preservation of institutions that then reproduce the original lie. This is how civilizations become self-sealing, not because the deception is flawless, but because it is interconnected. Every major falsehood becomes a beam supporting the same structure. Remove one, and the pressure transfers to all the others. That is why systems react so aggressively when certain questions are raised. It is rarely because one single question is dangerous in itself. It is because truly examining one lie often leads to another, and another, and another, until the person investigating is no longer challenging a detail. They are threatening the architecture, and architecture always defends itself, not only through censorship, but through ridicule, professional risk, reputational destruction, financial penalty, and social exile. Humans are tribal creatures. To be cast outside the circle has always carried fear. Systems know this. They do not need to physically eliminate every dissenter. They only need to make visible examples of enough people that others learn the cost of stepping too far outside sanctioned thought. That is why the policing of reality often looks cultural before it looks authoritarian. People mock what they have been trained to fear. They shame what they have been taught not to examine. They become voluntary enforcers of the worldview that imprisons them. This is one of the cruelest features of epic deception. The lied to become the guardians of the lie, not because they are evil, but because their identity is attached to the narrative. To challenge the narrative is to threaten the self but built inside it. Most people would rather defend a familiar falsehood than endure the death of a worldview. They would rather preserve internal comfort than undergo metaphysical dislocation. They would rather remain coherent inside an illusion than become destabilized in search of the real. And so the lie persists not only through elites or institutions, but through ordinary people who have mistaken adaptation for truth. This leads to another stone that must be turned. Not all large-scale deception begins with a grand centralized mastermind. Human beings often simply simplify the problem because they want a villain they can point to, but reality is more disturbing than that. Once a false structure is established, it begins to perpetuate itself through incentives alone. Bureaucracies protect themselves, careers depend on orthodoxy, industries monetize dependency, schools reproduce assumptions, families pass on inherited beliefs, communities punish deviation, algorithms amplify the conventional and suppress the destabilizing. The machine no longer needs a single hand on the lever. It runs because the entire populations are unconsciously invested in its continuation. This is what makes the deception feel total. It has become ecological, a habit of falsehood, an atmosphere people breathe from childhood so continuously that they no longer notice it. To understand why humanity has been lied to on such an epic scale, then we have to understand something uncomfortable about systems. Systems do not exist to reveal truth. They exist to preserve themselves. Sometimes truth helps with that. Often it does not. When truth threatens continuity, continuity usually wins. Institutions speak the language of service, progress, health, justice, knowledge, and order, but beneath all such language lies a simpler imperative: survive, expand, and maintain legitimacy. Anything that strengthens legitimacy is elevated. Anything that threatens it is marginalized. That does not mean every official account is false. That would be too simplistic. It means every official account must be examined through the lens of function. What does this story produce? What does it protect? What does it conceal? What behavior does it normalize? What alternatives does it render unthinkable? When you ask those questions consistently, the world begins to reorganize itself before your eyes. You begin to see that massive deception is not only about hiding forbidden truths, it is also about manufacturing usable humans, predictable humans, economically useful humans, politically manageable humans, psychologically governable humans, humans detached from deep memory, distracted from inner authority, alienated from genuine community, exhausted by survival, fragmented by noise, and dependent on external structures for meaning. A sovereign human being is difficult to exploit. A confused human being is infinitely easier. This is why modern systems often overload rather than simply suppress. In the past, censorship often meant silence. Now it often means noise, endless noise, contradictory reports, outrage cycles, emotional bait, identity warfare, data floods, expert conflict, trend churn, and perpetual distraction. The aim is not always to make people believe one specific thing. Sometimes it is enough to make them doubt the possibility of knowing anything at all. Once that happens, fatigue sets in. Cynicism replaces discernment. People stop searching. They retreat into comfort, entertainment, tribal belonging, or numbness. This is one of the greatest victories deception can achieve. Not that people believe the lie completely, but that they become too tired to pursue truth. An exhausted population is easier to manage than a convinced one, and yet there is something even deeper still. Humanity may have been lied to so thoroughly because the truth is not merely informational, it is transformational. Real truth does not leave people unchanged. It disrupts identity, rearranges values, reorders loyalties, and dissolves dependency. It exposes how much of life has been lived through inherited scripts. It reveals how many ambitions were implanted, how many fears were conditioned, how many desires were marketed, how many moral impulses were outsourced, and how many beliefs were never truly examined. Truth demands inner revolution, and inner revolution eventually becomes outer revolution. That is why systems built on hierarchy fear genuine truth at the deepest level, not because truth is chaotic, but because truth restores direct relationship to reality, direct relationship to conscience, direct relationship to memory, direct relationship to the sacred, if one wishes to use that word. Any power structure that depends on intermediaries will always be threatened by direct access. It cannot afford a population that no longer needs to be told who it is, what it should fear, or how it must live. A human being who remembers their own interior authority becomes difficult to program. This may be why the lie has been so young. Children arrive with openness, institution. I think I read that wrong. This may be why the lie has to begin so young. Children arrive with openness, intuition, curiosity, and unformatted perception. They ask fundamental questions naturally. They notice contradiction instinctively, but socialization gradually teaches them which questions are rewarded and which are dangerous, which truths are admissible and which are taboo, which instincts are to be trusted and which must be surrendered to experts, elders, textbooks, clergy, screens, and institutions. In other words, one of the deepest functions of civilization is often not awakening the mind, but narrowing it into socially manageable channels. The tragedy is that most people then call this maturity. They call it realism. They call it education. They call it becoming an adult, but often it is simply the formal burial of sovereign perception. Of course, not all lies are imposed only from above. Humanity also participates in self-deception. This must be said plainly, because otherwise the analysis becomes too easy. Human beings lie to themselves because truth has a cost. It can cost relationships, status, certainty, belonging, career, emotional security, and the comfort of inherited identity. Many people would rather preserve a stable fiction than enter the wilderness of reevaluation. They do not merely endure lies, they co-create them through avoidance. This is why large-scale deception works so well. It aligns external manipulation with internal weakness. The system offers comforting illusions, and the individual accepts them because they relive existential burden. Ready-made meaning is easier than existential responsibility. Inherited doctrine is easier than direct inquiry. Tribal slogans are easier than philosophical rigor. Moral certainty is easier than ambiguity. Scapegoats are easier than complexity. This does not excuse deception, but it explains why it proliferates. The architecture of the lie is built from both domination and desire. We must be honest enough to admit that humanity often prefers consolation to truth. That preference has been weaponized against it, and so the lie becomes civilizational. It enters law, ritual, myth, education, media, aesthetics, identity, and memory. It is woven into holidays, language, maps, textbooks, screens, expert panels, public ceremonies, and official grief. It becomes so ambient that to challenge it feels not like intellectual disagreement, but sacrilege. People react with outrage because the narrative is no longer just a belief to them. It is their world, their membership, their coherence, and their place in the human story. To question the lie is to threaten their cosmology. This is why those who awaken to large-scale deception often experience a kind of loneliness that is difficult to describe. It is not merely that they believe different things. It is that they have discovered most social reality is held together by mutual agreement not to look too closely. They realize that much of ordinary conversation is ritual maintenance of consensus. People repeat phrases, positions, and assumptions, not because they have deeply examined them, but because those phrases function as social passwords. To depart from them is to risk becoming unreadable to the group, and yet once seen, this cannot be unseen. The person who begins to perceive the scale of the lie often passes through several stages. First comes suspicion, then fascination, then obsession, then grief, because beneath the thrill of discovery lies mourning. Mourning for the years lived inside inherited distortion. Mourning for the trust misplaced in institutions that never deserved such innocence. Mourning for the realization that much of what shaped one's mind was not education but conditioning. Mourning for the people one cannot easily speak to anymore because the distance in perception has become too great. Then, if the person endures long enough without hardening into bitterness or falling into paranoia, another stage becomes possible: discernment. This is where the seeker matures, because one danger is awakening to widespread deception. This is where the seeker matures, because one danger in awakening to widespread deception is overcorrection. Once a person sees that they have been lied to, the temptation is to believe everything is false in the same way, at the same depth, for the same reason. But discernment requires patience. It requires precision. It requires the courage to say not only this is false, but also I do not yet know. It requires resisting the seduction of replacing one totalizing worldview with another merely because it feels oppositional. The point is not to become reflexively anti-everything. The point is to become inwardly clear enough to perceive without outsourcing perception. That is the true recovery of human dignity. Not perfect knowledge, but liberated inquiry. Not certainty, but integrity. Not blind belief, but grounded perception. This matters because the deepest answer to epic deception is not simply exposure. Exposure alone is not enough. People can be shown evidence and still remain unchanged if their identity is too bound to the lie. What must be restored is the human capacity for reality contact, the ability to observe carefully, then independently tolerate uncertainty. The ability to observe carefully, think independently, tolerate uncertainty, follow contradiction, question authority without worshiping rebellion itself, and hold one's center while the old maps fall apart. In that sense, the greatest theft was never merely information. It was confidence in direct knowing. Humanity was not only lied to about the world, it was taught to distrust its own ability to perceive the world. That may be the masterstroke, because once a people no longer trust themselves, they become permanently governable. They will beg to be instructed, beg to be interpreted, beg to be managed, and they will beg to be rescued from the confusion produced by the very systems that confuse them. And so the cycle continues. Lie, destabilize, offer authority, demand trust, repeat. This is not just political, it is civilizational, it is psychological, it is spiritual in the broadest sense of the word, because it concerns the relationship between human consciousness and truth itself. Why has humanity been lied to on such an epic scale about absolutely everything imaginable? Because truth gives rise to sovereignty, because sovereignty weakens dependency, because dependency is profitable, governable, and inheritable, because a species that remembers what it is becomes difficult to rule through fear, because false reality is easier to administer than awakened humanity, because controlling the mind is more efficient than controlling the body, because whoever frames the story often possesses the future, and because the greatest empires are not built merely on land or armies or currency, but on manufactured reality. But there is one thing that the architects of deception never fully accounted for. Reality resists permanent burial. Truth has a way of returning through fracture, through contradiction, through intuition, through anomalies that do not fit the script, through the quiet unease people feel when the official explanation no longer reaches the depth of what they are sensing, through memory, through conscience, through the unbearable weight of accumulated inconsistency. The lie can dominate an era, even many eras. It can shape textbooks and monuments and media cycles and institutions. It can define careers and ruin dissenters and populate the world with mirrors of itself. But it cannot become ultimate. It is always parasitic. It depends on suppression, repetition, and managed perception. Truth, by contrast, does not need management to exist. It only needs to be seen. That is why even massive systems remain fragile underneath their spectacle. They require constant maintenance, constant narrative repair, constant emotional manipulation, constant reinforcement. Truth does not tremble when questioned. Lies do. That is why questioning becomes sacred. Not because every question is correct, but because the honest questioning breaks the spell of automatic obedience. Maybe that is where humanity now stands, at the edge of remembered sight. Not yet free, but no longer fully asleep. Not yet clear, but no longer wholly convinced by inherited scripts. Perhaps the age we are entering in is not merely an age of information, but an age of exposure, where the volume of contradiction becomes too great to hide, and more people begin to feel that they are standing inside a world made of polished surfaces, concealing fractures beneath. If so, then the task is not simply to denounce the lie. It is to become ungovernable by falsehood, to rebuild the self from the inside out, to recover the courage to perceive directly, to refuse easy narratives, even the ones that flatter us, to remember that truth is not owned by institutions, purchased through approval, or granted by consensus. It is encountered, earned, lived, and sometimes suffered for. The final deception was never just that humanity was lied to. It was that humanity was made to believe it was too small, too powerless, too confused, too divided, and too dependent to ever find its way back. That is the one lie that must die first, because the moment a human being truly realizes that their mind was not made to be rented by the age, something irreversible begins. The old voices lose their spell. The old maps lose their authority. The old fear loses some of its grip. And in that quiet break from consensus, the first real freedom appears. Not freedom given by the system, freedom by needing the system not freedom from needing the system to tell you what is real. That is where the return begins. And once enough people begin that return, the epic lie no longer looks invincible. It begins to look exactly like what it always was. A structure held together by repetition, fear, and inherited sleep. Nothing more and nothing built on that foundation can stand forever. Jason Gray. #Winnipeg, #Manitoba, #Canada. Okay, all right. Thank you so much for joining me for that. And I will put the links in the description below. I'll see you next time.